Figures of authority, ciphers of regression. Notes on the return of representation in European painting, written by Benjamin H.D. Bushlow and published in October 1981. The essay deals with return to traditional modes, ideologies in art which signaled the end of avant-garde. The essay is divided in 5 parts. Part 1 of the essay establishes the questions Bushlow poses on the return of representation in European painting. He first questions the historical and aesthetic importance of this return. His argument is that how can the shift be an autonomous achievement of the masters? For these masters were in fact the servants of an audience that craved the restoration of the visual codes of recognizability. He questions these re-establishments at 3 levels of cause and effect. The first one being if the conventions of mimetic representation were re-established. 2. If the credibility of iconic referentiality was reaffirmed. And lastly, if the hierarchy of pictorial representations was again presented as an ontological question. He seeks to establish restorative phenomena in a historical and political context by the different ways of its occurrence, as like cause-effect or a mechanical reaction. For Bushlow, political oppression forever spawns traditional representation. To reaffirm the relationship of these phenomena, he undermines the arguments of new Sachlichkeit and Pictura Metaphysica. He acknowledges the shifts to be radical, but raises the question of conception through choices of modes and decisions of artists. He focuses on the extent of rediscovery and recapitulation of modes of representation in relation to political realities. The key argument here is to affirm the need for studying present developments in the context of historical repetitions. For the fall of the modernist paradigm is a cyclical phenomenon, just like the crisis of capitalist economics of 20th century. To assert this, he says, collapse of the modernist idiom is not without a precedent. Bankruptcy of capitalist economics and politics of 20th century has been consistently accompanied by a certain rhythm of aesthetic manifestations. This relationship is seen at 3 levels. 1. Constructing artistic movements to dismantle dominant ideologies. 2. A wipeout by the very artists of the movements by internalizing oppression through weakening melancholy. And lastly, by flattering reactionary power. He illustrates the consequences of not placing them in a historical context as a failure in understanding the mission of avant-garde, thereby creating a passive climate. Part 2. Repression and Representation. This part of the essay deals with the determinants and examples of modernism. Citing from history, the argument here is to mark the attempt of creating a new classicism by the artists. The end of modernism was signaled by the end of movements like Cubism and Futurism. Artists who had initiated these very movements abandoned their critical ideals and returned to the traditional forms. Bushlow gives us instances of painting techniques being readopted. However, they created a myth of new classicism in order to disguise their return as continuation and revalidation. The section of the essay primarily speaks of the repression, the coercion of returning to traditional forms. This was paralleled with regression through ideological justifications during the same period. The regression reveals the inherent tendency towards the myth of new classicism. There were attempts to re-establish a new aesthetic orthodoxy. The purpose to draw the period is to show the failed historical presence of modernism. Part 3 of the essay, Art, Past and Master. The extent of rediscovery of serving an authoritarian purpose of justifying the failure of modernism is the same as the extent of the underdeveloped concept of the master artist and is reintroduced to continue a cultural-oriented production. This manifestation reveals the elaborate connection between aesthetics and authoritarian domination. To prove this claim, he cites the example of Giorgio de Chirico voicing dislike towards dilettantism, socialism in lover art of Francis Picabia, and Picasso's opinion on dictatorship of painters. According to Bachelot, there is a sense of invalidity in the artist's claims to save their cultural practices, which seem to have lost their feasibility. A technique that indicates this failure and adoption of new classicism is style, which was traditionally rejected and was now being applied with historical meaning. Ideologically, that way, style becomes the equivalent of a commodity. Wasms began to become isms. The transformation of production is identified as ciphers of an enforced regression. These symbols make the avant-garde artist realize his historical failure. The modernist collage is bare and fragmented. There is an assertion of assembling the various broken parts in order to resolve the dilemma of aesthetic self-negation, that is, if the modernist programs gave perceptions of autonomy and self. A part of the essay that clearly shows the commodification of style. Part 4 of the essay, The Returns of the New. The argument contained in this part of the essay is the modes of artistic production are independent of context, and thus they can be easily reinvested with different meanings to suit purposes. They can be presented as radical and new. This regressive phenomena gets labeled as innovation. The German New Expressionists' newness is in their current historical availability and not in any innovation of artistic practice. Modernist high culture canonized aesthetic constructs and the artists. Criteria of aesthetic evaluation was if there was expressivity, sensuousness, a confrontation with ugly and magnificent both, the sublime notion is reaffirmed by alienation and loss. The point the essay is trying to make here is modernist high culture artists, instead of changing conditions, shifted rebellious actions into aesthetic. Bourgeois perception and mode of experience in paintings was countered by the avant-garde tradition of negation. Sensuousness, expressiveness and energy that provided instant gratification became postponed gratification in the bourgeois mode of experience. Bachelot characterizes Neo-Expressionism as a practice of collage and argued that Neo-Expressionist art was not a modernist but a historicist collage. Bachelot also argues that Neo-Expressionism was a reaffirmation of the modernist bourgeois tradition of sublimation. Aesthetic changes began to appear with the idea of painting as a sexual metaphor being abandoned. To prove this claim, he argues with Duchamp's interest in androgyny, talks of the ban on individual ownership, and the favor towards collective practice. However, the paintings with naive presuppositions, with immediate representation of artists' intention in traditional mode, which was complicit with the psychosexual aspect. These were more effective than paintings which inquired into their own procedures. An example of this would be concealment in Expressionism of Carol Duncan. An important aspect of the argument here is the relationship between regressions in postmodernism and neoclassicism. There is a similarity in the regressions in postmodernist painting and architecture and neoclassicism of Picasso, Cara, and other artists. The regressions suggest an experience of history as a private property. Contemporary Italians categorically revived historical production purposes, iconographic references, and aesthetic categories. There was an unearthing, a disentering of production modes. The experience has led to auratic nature of art, which satisfies contempt according to bourgeois. Aura thus spawns aesthetic pleasure. Nostalgia generates eclectic painting practices. This becomes the attractive part as by taking a moment from the past through modes that have historical roots. In the contemporary, it is an attempt to resurrect figuration, visual codes. Here, there is a reaffirmation that these are not due to precedents, but an attempt to reinstill the primary purpose of re-representations, which is to explore ideological dominations.